So please, guys, Daniel Morgar.
Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started. So this is a first time for us. We are in a room with other people who are looking at us, I think, which is a little bit intimidating, but, I'm sure we'll make our way through, and doing a live show with a hard time cap just for added extra difficulty, just for fun. But, yeah, it's an exciting week. It's WWDC week, and it was an interesting year. This is having come into WWDC since 2009. That was my first year. And every year there's sort of a different theme or a different flavor to the show. And I think when I was trying to listen for it, I think the phrase that Apple used many times to indicate what the theme was this year was technology and refinements. That in general, what they were doing were either introducing new technologies, all of their machine learning stuff or that type of thing, or it's a lot of refinements. It's lots of little things. And in some ways I like that as a developer. Like, it's not one of these years where there's this overwhelming sense of like, there goes my summer, I'll never see my children again, all these terrible things. Like, it's a summer where it's like, okay, I've got work to do, there's stuff to be done, but overall, unless you're in an area where one of these brand new, like totally new technology is relevant for you, you're just going to be tweaking stuff, making things a little bit better, which is nice in some ways. And maybe it's nice to have a year off from just this crazy sprint or this whole new platform or anything like that. And especially even some of the side platforms got almost no changes at all, so it's like, okay, I don't need to worry about that. I can just do some basic changes to get going.
Yeah, I mean, it's every year when we have this happen to us, this keynote thing. Every year there's it's a question mark of how much work we'll have in the summertime, as you said, and there's, as the App Store and as these platforms have gotten more and more mature, the advances have gotten more and more specialized. You see things being added every year that only make sense for a narrow subset of app types, and if your app happens to be one of those things, then you have new things you can do. And as time goes on, more and more of the advances are of that type, rather than things that we all have to now suddenly deal with. Like when the big iOS 7 redesign, that's like, wow, everyone has to deal with that. Or when major features to the OS were still being added on a regular basis, things like notifications and that was like things that we all really had things to do about, and had potential new things for our apps to do and major new areas of markets that would open up. And that just really hasn't happened a lot recently, because these platforms are maturing. That type of innovation just is slowing down by necessity, because these things are getting more and more just mature and better rounded. So as you mentioned, I think it's worth pointing out that basically I think if your app runs on the watch, the TV, or in messages, I don't think you have much to do. I think you kind of get a vacation summer. If you were waiting on a particular Siri kit intent that didn't exist last year, you still probably don't have much to do, because there weren't that many added. My summer is much more free than I thought it would be.
Maybe you can make a new app. I hear it's really fun. Let me tell you, I have a lot of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I was hoping for the audio Siri kit intent, and that didn't come. And maybe I'll get it next year, maybe not. Who knows? But for the and I was also expecting a large redesign of iOS, or at least a moderate scale redesign. And I think what we got was more along the lines of the iOS 6 redesign. Like, most people don't remember, but iOS 5 to 6, 6 actually did step back a lot of that skeuomorphism, and it was like a half step of a redesign. And I think we got a similar scale redesign with this. So we now have those new giant header text bars that I honestly am not a big fan of right now, but maybe I'll get used to them. And it's kind of unclear as to whether we all should redesign our apps like this or not. Sometimes when Apple does UI Chrome changes, sometimes it only ends up being important for Apple's apps. There are certain UI conventions that you see them and you think, oh, that's a system app. And back in the olden days, it was a design goal, considered good design, to try to make your app look like the system apps. But I think the window of time where that was true is fairly short, and that it quickly after that became more trendy to like have your own identity, your own visual design, and designers kind of started taking over the world, and really, it became better design or better respected design to not use the system stock stuff, or to use it very loosely and to really heavily style it your own way. So if you design your app now to use this new, big, H2 style, like big unstyled header, taking up half the top of the screen. If you do that with your apps, it might end up being considered good design. It might look weird if you don't adopt that, 6 months from now. But it also might just be that's how the boring system apps look, and it'd be weird if your app looks like that. We don't really know yet, but I would say the scale of the redesign that we have is not really something that forces us all to immediately start taking action with our own designs to try to get close to it.
No, and I think, too, it's when I see a change like that, I always try and think of what is Apple trying to point us towards. And in many ways, I think that particular design, like, you like it or you don't like it, but it seems like they are de-emphasizing information density and saying that, essentially vertical real estate on the screen is not at a premium anymore. That you can just essentially throw away the top 10% of the screen, which is what this new navigation bar looks like, and that's fine, which maybe is indicative that taller screens are coming, or just in general there's sort of this emphasis towards let's smush things down and take advantage of the size of the screen in that way. So maybe even if it's not necessarily adopting what Apple's doing, it's just saying that's the direction that they're leading towards. Because I think in many ways at WWDC, one of the fun games I try and play is what are they not saying, but they're kind of saying? Because usually there's these clues and these hints that they're kind of poking towards that are, well, in retrospect, either with new hardware or even just next year at WWDC will make more sense. These little things that they're pointing to. So that's something that I think about when I see these sort of subtle design things, and there seems to be an emphasis on dynamic type this year, which is again all about in some ways being less specific about information density. That making your app cool when it has gigantic fonts. It's a good accessibility feature, but it seems like just in general they're trying to move away from that kind of a very dense display.
Yeah, and it's, they're doing that in these apps, in the system apps and everything, and we can speculate, that probably is because of maybe some bigger, taller screen phone coming this fall, as all the rumor things have pointed out. But there's also a huge install base of phones where that might not look good on. The SE is selling really well. I mean, I don't know, like my metrics on my app, and granted, it's a podcast app listened to mostly by nerds, so it's not going to be representative of the entire market. But my app is basically split 45-45-10 between the three screen sizes of phones right now. It's really a lot of people are using the Plus phone, a lot of people are using the 7 size phone, but then also 10% or so are using the SE size phone, and that's not a small number. I can't make the interface terrible or unusable or suck for that 10%. And that 10% is not going down. It's when the SE came out, it kind of boosted and leveled that number. And so we have to we can't just say our designs have to look good on the phone that comes out this fall that might have a weirdly tall screen. It also has to look good on everything else. So it's a fairly aggressive new design philosophy that we might pragmatically not want to take.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are sponsored this week by Linode. Linode is powerful web hosting that you can set up in just seconds. And their tools are easy to understand. They let you choose your resources, your Linux distro, giving you the power and flexibility you need, all starting at just $5 a month for a Linode server with 1 gig of RAM in the Linode cloud. They have industry-leading performance, native SSDs, access to a 40 gigabit network, and Intel Xeon E5 processors, the fastest ones in the cloud market. With 9 data centers spread across the world that you can choose from, you can serve your customers where they are. There's an API to manage your Linode servers. You can easily automate tasks, manage a whole bunch, develop custom applications with super simple scaling. You can resize your resource levels in just a few clicks, and it's all manageable via their awesome web interface or the command line. All their pricing tiers also feature hourly billing. If you don't need a server for the whole month, you can just do hourly billing. It's really, really wonderful. We both use it. Highly recommended. They have fantastic pricing available. In my opinion, it's the best, most competitive pricing in the industry. You can get a server, again, with 1 gig of RAM for just $5 a month. And it scales up to ridiculous levels like 16 gigs of RAM for just $60 a month. This is really, really great pricing. Across the board, they're offering twice the amount of RAM that you get in pretty much anywhere else. As a listener of this show, if you sign up at linode.com/radar, you'll be supporting us, and you get $20 towards any Linode plan. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, there's nothing to lose. So go to linode.com/radar to learn more, sign up and take advantage of that $20 credit, or use promo code RADAR2017 at checkout. Thank you so much to Linode for supporting this show.
So, as cool as all the actual technologies and APIs and SDKs are, the thing that in many ways I think I was most excited about is the new App Store app.
To me, that's a huge question mark. You know,
I'm excited that it's changed. I'm slightly terrified as well.
Yes.
By the change, but I'm excited that it is changing.
Yeah, any change to the App Store should terrify all of us, because it basically means that whatever our business is now, however the App Store is serving us now, it's probably going to change dramatically this fall. We don't know in which direction.
Yeah.
You know, like if they change the search algorithms, that can make a huge difference for a lot of us. Of what our sales are. If they change things like what a feature is worth. Which they have here. The new App Store has a much lower information density, as you mentioned earlier with info density. It changes.
Yeah.
It's a much lower information density, and they've kind of been going towards this in the recent search redesigns and everything in the last couple of years. But now the whole store is like that, where you basically have giant screen filling cards for apps, and so there's no more big list screens where you get 1 million of them on screen at once. So basically, the number of featured spots appears to have decreased dramatically, but each one is now worth a lot more. And I don't know whether they're going to have different levels, subdirectory levels inside of it, that are more high density or whatever. But the main App Store features are now very, very few, but very valuable. And so if you get one, that's probably awesome. But I think your chances of getting one are now reduced. So it's kind of I don't know what to think yet about it. They're changing more often. They're going to be every day instead of every Thursday that they've been updating some of the other editorial sections. So that's nice for a lot. But how many of us are ever going to get one of those feature blocks? It seems like it's an interesting change. I'm glad they're changing it, but if I had to guess, I'm not sure it's going to benefit most people.
When I see it, though, what I like is that it changes my goal for what the App Store, my App Store page, my App Store presence, in a way that I find slightly motivating, I guess. It's my goal is now to, I would say recently, for maybe the last couple of years, I have cared less about being featured, because the way the App Store is now, it doesn't actually have a huge impact on downloads. It's nice, emotionally, if I get featured, it feels really good, and that's awesome, hooray. But in my experience, it's actually a fairly minor impact on downloads, which is, I think, largely to do just with the way that you go to the featured tab right now, and you'll probably see there's at least 20, 30 apps on that screen at once. And so if you're one of those, that's not nearly as impactful. And when I see this, it's kind of nice that now instead it's, if you are the app of the day, and it's nice too, you said, it's going to be hard to get it. There are still 365 of those a year.
And in different countries too. It's it's not going to be just one a day. It's going to be probably one per country or territory per day.
Yeah, and if you are that app, if you sort of win that lottery, you are doing, I imagine that will have a substantial impact, that if the home tab of the App Store app has a giant full screen ad for your app, either your app is really bad or you're going to have a good day. And so I'm really excited about that as a goal and as a motivation. And it's nice to kind of have this now in the back of my mind that my goal is to do things that will get me onto that tab. And I can do things that are within my control to make that happen. I can and getting it's nice that I feel like it'll actually have an impact. It is going to, I think, though, be very much a rich get richer and a poor get poorer kind of a situation. Like, I've been playing with it a little bit on the beta, and if you don't, the search area is still, the search area too is much less dense than it used to be, but the new apps tab, is very, very focused on just the very, very top stuff. And if you're not one of those apps, if you're not in some ways they took the top charts, and rather than being a chart, it basically just shows the top 3 apps or the top 4 apps now. That's a pretty narrow thing. The top 3 apps is probably going to be Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat or something like that for a long time. There's no way my app is ever going to break into that area. But I think more generally, I love the feeling that over the last year, we've had at least a half dozen substantial, sort of business and app store improvements that make me feel, as someone who makes my living in this world, that this is, this is a lively platform that I can be learning to get better on. Because back in the early days of the App Store, in some ways it reminds me of those early days where one of the ways that I remember being able to sort of get my sort of when I was trying to stand up my business was by being a student of the App Store, by trying to understand how it works, how I can optimize what I'm doing to work well there. And now that it's this brand new thing, it's that starts all over again. All this summer I can try and work on, what do I need to make my app assets look like to look really good here? Now we have auto-playing videos for app previews, and you can have 3 app previews rather than 1 app preview. There's all kinds of other information that we can specify. We can give our apps subtitles and marketing copy. We can promote in-app purchases from on our app page. There's so much there that isn't the developer side, that isn't that kind of thing. But I think in some ways I'm glad that there's relatively little to do on the technology side this year, that I'm going to expect to be spending most of my summer just working on those assets, working on trying to work out how to market in this new app store, because it is a very new and different experience.
In many ways, maybe that's kind of like a metaphor for what we should be doing pretty much all the time with our apps now. Technology is way less important than it's ever been for our apps, for most of what we do. And the marketing side in the App Store, and getting all that metadata right and good, and all these new ways, they added app preview videos before, and now they're more emphasized and there's more of them, and you basically have more in the App Store that you need to apply reasonable production value to. In the olden days, it was basically just an icon and maybe some design inside your app, but you could get away with not much else. And now that's long since been surpassed as the table stakes. And now you need to consider things like your copy, although whoever reads it, but you need to at least consider your title, and your screenshots have to be really good. And as we discussed in the past, people keep shoving more stuff into screenshots. It isn't just a screenshot. It's here's a fake phone spanning over the 2 frames and big marketing text above it and everything. And so the production value that is required to succeed in the App Store is going up. And in some ways, that's going to be a burden. It's going to be a burden on a lot of us, especially people who have smaller budgets for that sort of thing and can't do it themselves with their own skills. That's going to raise the cost of succeeding in the App Store. But I think we were already headed in that direction. And that was already kind of the reality of the market. So now we are going to be forced to do that for our apps, but we already really were. And if we're willing to put in that extra effort to do things like get a nice app preview video and put some effort into really optimizing the way the new store pages look and the new things we can do on them, I think we will be rewarded for that. And that's, overall, that's going to matter more than if we spend an extra 8 hours coding a feature that not a lot of people are actually going to use or care about.
Yeah. And it changes. It makes me really nervous to have to make my App Store page super pretty. But on the flip side, it's that's an attainable goal. That is something that I can definitively work towards and to make happen. And it's not unreasonable that, in some ways, it's nice when we were able to get away without that, but that seems like that is less and less the case. And we can now reset our reviews.
Yeah, our ratings.
Our ratings whenever we want. So we finally got that. Like
that's awesome.
Like years ago, that was on my list of, when I had my 12 things I wanted to change in the App Store. That was back then, and now we finally got it. And like these little changes like that are just super exciting. As a developer, Apple is clearly trying to make this more viable for us.
Yeah, and it's one thing I wonder about. Like, you mentioned before, like the value of a feature seems to have been going down in recent years. It seems, I think industry-wide, we've seen this kind of slowdown of people willing to just browse for new apps and just install them easily. Like the cost per install, if you're trying to get, if you're measuring that kind of thing, it has been going up over the last few years. And I wonder, like, I bet Apple is probably doing a lot of these changes to the App Store and like the new daily features and cleaning it all up and everything. They're trying probably to do this to increase the number of times that people go to the App Store just casually. Like what we used to do in the old days, like when the App Store was new, and we just like go there when we were bored and just find some new apps and download them. And I think a lot of people did that, and these days a lot of people don't. So Apple's obviously trying to push the market in this direction to go back to doing that, but it might not succeed. Like this actually might not happen. Yeah. So it's really kind of up in the air. Like putting all this effort into your App Store page is going to become table stakes, but we don't know actually how much it'll pay off yet.
Sure. But I mean, that's always the case. But the reality is, for a year, this is the App Store that we're going to have to make work for our businesses. And so it's like one way or the other, this is what we got. So we just sort of do our best and hang on for the ride.
I did, before we run out of time, I did want to talk a little bit about the iPad advances. And not in too many specifics, but basically the iPad software, like every year we try to figure out like what kind of new apps are now made possible by whatever they announced. What can, not only what additional features can we add to our existing apps, but what new markets will now exist? Because that's often a place where you can reap good rewards. If you're, and I mean, you made a lot of your career off of this, right?
That is my career.
Like, going to where new territory has just opened up and just being the first one there with a decent app.
Yeah.
And that you will often reap rewards from that. It's not guaranteed, but it's often the case. And there's often fewer people there on day one than you think there will be. So what's new this year? And I think that there's not a whole lot of like brand new, like complete areas, but the iPad redesign and the new productivity features in the iPad, I think, will be one of these areas. The big, a lot of iPad Pro app makers have had a hard time making the economics work out. And the question is not like whether you can't sell software for a good price on the iPad. I think the question is like, are there enough people doing pro work on the iPad that will be seeking out an app like yours? And that, to me, goes down to like, how many people are using the iPad for their work? Yeah. And before, it was cumbersome to do a lot of these things. You could do it, and we know people who do, but there was a lot of friction. And now they have reduced a lot of that friction and really broken down a lot of the barriers and made a lot of the iPad UI, more Mac-like. And don't say that, but that's really what they did. And so now I think a lot more people will be doing work on the iPad than before. So I think that might create more of a market for iPad Pro software than we had before. And it's not to say that like you can go in with an iOS level price. If you're thinking of like developing Pro software on the Mac and you sell your Pro app on the Mac for $100, and that succeeds for you, you can't go to the iPad and sell it for $10 and expect to have the same success. You're going to have to like charge more, and it's going to have to be worth more for people. Just like on the Mac, because they're making it more Mac-like. But I do think that's a market that did not exist very strongly before, and now I think that's going to be a bigger market because the iPad is now such a better tool for getting work done in a professional capacity, or really, honestly, any capacity, like email attachments. Like, it's so much easier now than it was before. I think there's going to potentially be a bigger market there than there was. So maybe the place to be this year isn't some new extension type that became available on iOS or something else. Maybe the place to be this year is boring productivity apps on the iPad.
Maybe. I mean, the thing that's... I struggle a little bit. Like, I'm excited with the iPad changes because I know I have many friends who love the iPad and are just through the roof about this. Like, I was sitting next to Federico Vitici during the keynote, and like there was a glow coming off of him for the entire show because he was so excited, and like that is really cool. I mean, as a developer, I love like I got to imagine the iPad team who made those features love hearing the feedback of these people who are so genuinely excited about it. And it's like, I like that that's there. I'm still nervous that whether or not it will be enough it's like you have such this chicken and egg problem with the iPad, I feel, where if Apple can pull enough people into the platform to make it, to have that richness of ecosystem, it is a really interesting and compelling device. And when the iPad first came out, like whatever that was, 4, 5, 6 years ago, like it was a pretty good place to be an app developer. Like I made a substantial part of my business working on the iPad for years, and then it just kind of fell off. And in many ways, it kind of fell off with Apple's sales graph. You know, like the iPad sells less and less every year. My hope is that what Apple is doing with these kinds of changes is if they can pull that back and kind of have an inflection point where suddenly it gets a little bit more traction. It's all these things that were just a little bit too difficult before now become that little bit more easy and are now more possible. Maybe we'll get there. And if they do, then like that's interesting. And I could definitely see transitioning my focus a bit back towards the iPad because honestly, recently it hasn't been there at all. And I like the iPad. Like it's an interesting platform in that respect. But there's such this tricky thing when the iPhone is so viable as an app platform that the iPad could be viable as an app platform. But if it isn't, it's like, and if lots of developers don't go there, it won't be. But lots of developers going there won't make it viable. And so it's very circular, and I'm still of two minds as to whether, like this, I'm not sure if this year I'll be focusing much on the iPad, or if it's one of those like wait and see, have a couple of quarters of sales to see if the iPad sales are starting to come back out, waiting to see if there's sort of an uptick on things, because I don't know, I want to be excited, but I'm like, of all the things they announced, it's like I'm excited, but I'm much more cautiously excited than I am on a lot of the other platforms, and sort of the ways that Apple's trying to push us this year.
Yeah, I think that's probably a safe bet because, like, with the iPad stuff, like, you never really know until like a year or two later, what swing the market has taken. It's a lagging indicator, and a lot of these new iPad productivity gains are only going to be compelling or widely used on pretty high end, pretty recent iPads, which is not a large slice of the market, and so we really won't know yet. So I guess I agree with you. It's probably a little bit risky to jump in right now, but I do think like there's something about the iPad that people love it. Like they tangibly love this device. They want to use it more. And the story I hear over and over again is, I would love to get more work done, or I'd love to use this thing more, but I can't do what I need to do, or it's too cumbersome, or whatever else. So I think there's something there, and I think people will try really hard to make it work for them again now that we have radically new capabilities. I mean, when iOS 9 launched with the multitasking for the first time, that converted a ton of iPad skeptics over into being iPad lovers and iPad workers. And now there's another step, probably of that magnitude, or even more so, that I think might do that same thing. The only question is, will it stick or will it be a fad? And it's hard to base major business decisions on that.
Yeah, and I think I've been doing this long enough that I increasingly have a sense of sort of caution about those kinds of things, which in many ways is probably to my detriment. And I'm very aware of the fact that I probably wouldn't be able to have a sustainable business at this point if I was cautious in the past. That in some ways it's going to take developers making kind of reckless and sort of slightly, wild decisions to pursue and push the boundaries on the iPad for the iPad to be a viable platform. And I will say one thing that Apple tends to do well is if developers do go down that road, they tend to, they're good at recognizing them, at promoting them, and at helping them. That if you are at WWDC this week and you go down to a lab and you're trying to do something, or you want to reach out to developer relations and you're having a problem trying to push the boundaries, there's a very good chance they will encourage that. So I would encourage anybody who's more adventurous than I am to dive into that, because I think it's not an easy win, but there's a good opportunity there.
Are you saying you might make more apps?
It's possible.
That's impressive. All right. Well, I think we're out of time this week, everybody. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.